Greetings, friends. I'm 176 pages into this book, Revolutionary Europe, 1783 to 1815, by George Rudé. I just wanted to talk about some of what I've taken away from this book. It's about the situation in Europe as a whole, and it talks about France during that time. So specifically, the lead up to the French Revolution itself, the Napoleonic period, which I haven't gotten into yet, and the situation, how Europe reacted to the revolution in France. It's obviously centered on the French Revolution, but it has this peripheral focus, so it doesn't go into like such depth. When certain public figures get killed, like, he's not spending time on details. He's just telling you the basic stuff that you need to know, what happened. And of course, he's giving his interpretation. That's always going to happen. So obviously, I'm influenced by what his bias is. Around 1789, 1790, 1791. I mean, it's complicated. There were different things going on, but that's basically where you could start it. And then it had more events that continued during the 1790s, which gave way to the Napoleonic period, and all, which is its own history. But so basically, that's when this thing started in France. There was the American Revolution not long before this, about 15 years. I guess it was 1789 when the storming of the Bastille happened. That would have been 15 years, roughly, after the end of the American Revolution, which concluded in 1783. According to George Rudé, the influence of the American Revolution on France was not so much ideological. There was some inspiration that the United States had been able to defeat the monarchist Great Britain, and they'd been able to create their own republic. But that influence paled in comparison to the influence of the philosophes, so-called, the Enlightenment writers of the time, who were much more prominent in Europe, of course. But, however, the American Revolution, at least according to George Rudé, did have a huge effect in causing the French Revolution. At least it was one of the principal ingredients, indirectly, because of the debt, the massive debt that France got into to support the United States against Great Britain successfully. However, she was bankrupt by the end of it. Now, I'm surprised that this went on so long. I mean, the real revolution didn't start until about 16 years after the conclusion of peace between the United States and Great Britain. So I don't know, but I guess the costs were passed along, I guess, in terms of loans. But eventually, there comes a reckoning. And so by the late 1780s, the French monarchy was trying to figure out how to get more money to pay off all of its debts, to, prevent insolvency. And that was why they were trying to expand their power, and their power of taxation specifically, which did fall more on the lowest class of society. They were proportionally taxed far more than the ranks higher up. Generally speaking, there might be obviously exceptions here and there, but so that was indirectly the financial ruin, not ruin, but extreme financial strain of supporting the Americans, which is funny because France was a monarchy at the time. Ideological influence is one thing, but hard gold and silver is quite another thing. So let's be clear, like, economic hardship is going to cause more cause for rebellion than some philosophical ideas. The real economic factors was the debt, the increased taxation, and the increased strain, and the ruffling of feathers is because people didn't know where this thing is going to stop. And of course, during the revolution itself, they instituted their own currency, which had terrible problems. The currency kept crashing. There was the assignat. Then there was another currency after that, and I mean, they all suffered terrible inflation during the revolutionary years. And that had to do with the rising and falling of meat and bread, which got out of control for many people to be able to buy. But let's consider the still significant influence of the philosophers. This was the Enlightenment generation. Philosophers, the writers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, other writers, Rousseau before him. Rousseau wasn't around to see the revolution himself. So you got to take the influence of these guys somewhat seriously, but also with a grain of salt, because they weren't all interpreted the same way. And lower class people might interpret something that they want out of these writers, and then different from what someone of a higher class might interpret, or the different people, different factions in the so-called same class might have, get different things. But generally, there was a skepticism of religion in the Enlightenment in these writers. Idealism, a belief in the sacred nature of man in his natural, so-called natural state, where he's more noble. The idea of the blank slate, that man can be shaped to be good solely by the goddess of reason, which is actually a real thing that they tried to institute briefly during the revolution, which is funny because the church played a role in starting the revolution. They contributed it. But the church is divided among itself, but there were components in the church that did participate in bringing about the revolution. But why did it happen in France? Because this author argues that it was because things had improved. That's the main takeaway for me, which I find so interesting, is things got better in France materially. Like in our own ages, things are relatively advanced technologically, materially. We have lots of food in our cities still, and we have more possessions, more clothing certainly, more access to the basic needs of life than we would have had 200 years ago. Similarly, at the end of the 18th century, Western Europe had been going through a commercial expansion, and this had affected England too. And you could ask, why didn't something like the revolution occur in England? Well, they had their English Civil War in the 17th century, and maybe you could say, well, England was still a bit less developed economically in the 17th century. There would have been perhaps, I don't want to say more poor people, but maybe not as big of a bourgeoisie in the 17th century in England as existed in France by the end of the 18th century. And the thing is, so this is just my hypothesis, I can't really say, but if you have the Civil War, which established like a constitutional monarchy, because they also cut off their king's head, but then they eventually brought back the king, brought back a limited monarchy, where the monarch is sort of like no longer supreme in power. He has to deal with parliament and deal with the democratic process, but it wasn't fully democratic. It was sort of just not even, you wouldn't really call it democratic, more like oligarchic, or where the bigwigs representing the landed nobility, but also representing merchant interests and the new banking elite. People like that, they would be able to get their say a lot of the time in politics, but the king was respected and still had a lot of power. Like, he could give his support to certain parties, and I still see this as not desirable to a full monarchy, but that's beside the point. The point is that it was still more stable than what France attempted, which was to get rid of all monarchy. And I guess you could argue that ended up happening in England too, because the Queen today has no real power at all. But the king would have had more power in English history in the 18th century, than would have been the case today, or would have been the case after King Louis lost his head. But this happened at a time when things were getting better. So why would a revolution occur that so thoroughly and radically, there's so many people upset and they're so agitated that they will really turn things upside down, and it'll never go back to normal again, or it will never go back to what it was before again? Well, part of the reason is that people become more perceptive of their inequality in developing times, in times where things are relatively good, because of trade. So trade is interesting. Trade is something that's associated with obviously wealth and the world. There's some questionable nature to the whole trade thing, because Judas sold out Jesus for a small quantity of silver, and the whore of Babylon. Of course, a certain ethnic group, and not just that ethnic group, but even a certain culture in the West, love of money. So it's interesting that at a time when trade increases, you do get this agitation eventually for the revolution. The thing is that there were different groups. There were like different revolutions, you could even say, going on. But first it was like a bourgeois who were the city who lives in the burgs, or like, it's a French word or a German word, like a burg, like a city, a town dweller. Like they had more power in the Middle Ages than peasants in the countryside or serfs in the countryside. So that process just sped up during the 18th century. So you got more of this middle class. I mean, there were agricultural pressures, there were famines, and not famines, but just like very tough economic times where the price of bread would go high. Food riots and small agitations around the countryside, which was normal. I mean, that happened. That's not an unknown thing to happen in France, but that was sort of like fuel in the fire, these bad harvests, these high price, and then the whole free trade argument. Some people being for free trade with Britain, others being against it. I mean, I've read Adam Smith, but honestly, I can't say. I mean, it's a complicated thing. Who knows in the circumstances, like, but the point is that some people were feeling the pinch from free trade policies. Others were like, we need to do this. So it was just a lot of factionalism. And so I'm describing the middle class and some of the nobility. They're the ones that sort of started this revolution going, the first one in 1789. Kings aren't perfect either, but the king before them had done a relatively poor job of allowing bureaucracy to grow, and there becoming little chance that the lower nobility could move up the social scale. You had to be close to the king's court in order to be in the top of society, and there was not much chance beyond how you were born of getting into that small group. So even the nobles were feeling excluded, and once you exclude the nobles, then they're agitating for their own interests, and they got some of the church alongside them because they were legitimately reacting to Octopus growing in power of this king's power, and maybe he was legitimately trying to reassert his rights. I don't know. I'm not educated enough in this. Maybe the king was just trying to, lay down the law like was a divine right, and maybe there wouldn't have been anything wrong with that, but it really ruffled a lot of feathers, and people were feeling the pinch of taxes, more taxes. Monarchs can get it wrong. But then this monarch, the one that was feeling the pinch during the actual revolution, had actually been showing some desire to make things better, but it was kind of too late. It was like, well, these problems have been brewing for a while, so even the king can try to change things, but it may be beyond his hands, and it's like it's too late. There's going to be some movement against him at some points. It was the upper classes, not the commoners, not the common laborers. It was sort of more like this middle class, like I guess that would be guilds and blacksmiths and craft makers, but more of like lawyers, merchants, sort of clerks, kind of like you're getting up to the high class, but you're not nobility. So sort of like higher class bourgeois. That was sort of what got this thing going in the first. But then they enlisted the help of the sans-culottes, which was, sans means without in French. Culottes at the time meant breeches or pants. So they were poor enough that they didn't have a basic status symbol. And a lot of French had land, like apparently 2/3 of all the peasants in France, of all the people in France, did actually own at least some small plot of land. But that's still 1/3 of the country that didn't have any land. And in the city of Paris, the lowest laborers. But there were a lot of them. They were the base population. And they were enlisted in the initial revolt. But then there was always this tension between them and the bourgeois. Because the nobles were often purged. I mean, the nobles retreated because they got purged out of France. A lot of them did, but then they were inspiring royalist risings. But there was no serious threat from them in Paris originally. The conflict was the tension between the sans-culottes and the so-called bourgeois, and then the so-called upper bourgeois, like lawyers and clerks and men who want to one day think of themselves as nobles, and then the lower half of the bourgeois, who are like smiths and craftsmen and shopkeepers, that sort of stuff. And then below them, the sans-culottes, the laborers, who are just like, well, we don't really have anything here. We don't have much to lose, in other words. And they're the ones who caused the food riots. And I mean, it was tough for them because the price of bread might triple. And then they might not be able to afford bread or the price of other foodstuffs. So they were played off one against each other. And the Jacobins had to contend with the Girondins. The Girondins was sort of like a more of the upper bourgeoisie, like, let's not make this too radical. Okay, we've had our revolt, let's impose checks on it. And the Jacobins weren't so committed. They were like waiting to see which way the wind was going, and then they would enlist the help of the sans-culottes for them to take power. So the Girondins, I mean, a lot of this had to do with France's military endeavors, and a lot of this is just based on luck. You can't really say who knows what was going to happen at the time, but France was involved in war with other countries around Europe, and the reason that these other countries, I should have said this earlier, why they didn't get into this sort of revolutionary situation is because they didn't have the prosperity of France at that time. Spain was much more divided culturally than France. So there were all sorts of political uprisings in Spain, but nothing on the size of the French, because the Spanish people were more divided. Like, there's Portugal, there's Catalonia, there's the Basque, there's Muslims in Spain not that long ago in history. So it's more of a fractured place. That's one reason why you didn't get this like large scale revolution like happened in France. France, it has a lot of local dialects and certainly a lot of nuances to its culture, but at the same time there was a lot of more cultural unity than perhaps in Spain. But you didn't get that so much in these Eastern European countries. Workshop industry and so-called cottage industry, spinning in a lot of these countries, but it wasn't on the scale of modern factories. Not that existed in England or France really at this time either, but it just wasn't on the right scale in these other countries. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about the societal breakdown of Poland or Austria. In all of these other countries, there wasn't the bourgeois concentration. There were more people on the bottom and a much more strong aristocracy. Let's just say that. And this was the case in Prussia, for sure. And Poland was sort of also divided and partitioned, or had different spheres of influence at that time. So it wasn't going to be embarking on anything on a unified scale. But in France, there was another time where the sans-culottes, then they came and they protested, and then they kicked out the Girondins. The Jacobins came to power using the sans-culottes. This is how Robespierre came to power. Robespierre was a Jacobin, and then he was one of their leading ideologues. And he's the guy who tried to institute this goddess of reason, and they changed all the months. I don't know if it was the Jacobins or who did it, but they briefly in French history, like, they changed their calendar, and they changed all the names in the calendar to like Brumaire and Thermidor and just all these weird sounding semi-Greek or Roman sounding names. One of the reasons some of the church had encouraged the revolutionary activity was that they were also getting encroached upon. Like, they were losing sees, or they were losing more of their jurisdictions to the king or the bureau, to the king's bureaucrats. So there was some agitation. But then later on, of course, they experienced the bad effects because a lot of the revolution had an anti-religious character to it, and as I may have forgot to mention earlier, but a lot of the philosophes were basically proto-atheists. They accepted Christianity, but they saw it as like a useful expedient. They didn't actually believe in it. And they were, people like Voltaire were actually relatively skeptical and cynical of religion, Christianity specifically. I read Voltaire's book, Candide. If you know that book, it's like he mocks the idea that everything happens for the best by having a lot of bad stuff happen to this guy as he travels across the world, and just all these ridiculous things happen to him. And there's a religious figure in the book that is not there in all of the book. He's there in the beginning and later on, but he's there to say, oh, it's okay, everything happens for the best, but it's just to be mocked by more disaster and famine and earthquakes and war and whenever all these bad things happening. So it's almost like this cynical, skeptical, poisonous attitude, you might say. But basically, a lot of chaos happened. A lot of people lost their heads. And it was just different groups playing off of one another. And then one getting kicked out of power. And then another one coming to power. And then neither group really stayed in power for very long. For more than like a matter of months or more than a year or 2 years. Before getting kicked out and potentially imprisoned or exiled or executed. And this happened from, most of the 1790s. Like, I haven't gotten into the Napoleonic period. I guess Napoleon sort of brought more stability, but a lot of more war in the rest of Europe, but he had more of an iron fist. But I'm not gonna get into that. This video is long enough. Hasta luego, amigos.